This was supposed to be scrap wood, but it's way too pretty for that. So here's the story. About a month ago, my wife sent me a couple of pictures of this table that she'd found on the side of the street in our neighborhood. So someone was throwing it out. And did I maybe want it for the wood? So in the pictures, it looked like solid wood and, you know, not a veneer or something, and I figured I could use a bit more wood in my rack, so I jumped in the van and raced over, and when I got there, it looked like solid white oak. So we threw it in the van and took it home, and in the garage, we unpacked it and set it up and cleaned it off, and very quickly we decided that I couldn't face just cutting it up for lumber. It was way too nice for that. So I'm gonna try refinishing it. The top looks old and worn. Over here, the finish is just about gone. You can see through the bare wood and there's little paint stains on it. Here, there's a big splotch, which I think might be a water stain. And at first I thought this was a burn, but I think it's a residue. It's like something was left on top of it wet, but it might be a burn. So we really are gonna have to take this down to bare wood, but look at all the ray flecks in this. This is some major Quartersawn oak here. Unfortunately, there are no leaves, but the mechanism works perfectly. The top attaches to the base with these wing nuts, which the previous owner very nicely left attached to the table for us. So with those 4 wing nuts removed, the top just pops off the base. So the whole thing breaks down really nicely for transport or storage. And while the top is off, let's take a look at this. I'm thinking this is factory furniture, probably from the early part of the 20th century, but there's no brand name, no maker's mark, there's no date, there's nothing on the bottom. There's a little hole here, but I think that's maybe from something with the mechanism. It's slotted screws all the way around, so I think this is definitely an older piece. Quite the dripping marks here. I'm wondering if it was stood on edge and if this is just old finish, maybe from when it was made or just from when it was stored all those years. This is the mechanism for latching the 2 pieces together. When you lift it up, it actually pushes the leaves apart so that you have a little bit of a gap there, and then after that it can be pulled. Oh, what's it caught on? Oh yeah, it drops down and you can pull the pieces apart. And when it closed again, it pops in and then you just latches it tight. I don't need to do anything with this. It's solid and it works. It's hard to pick up on camera, but the table skirt is also made of solid wood, several layers that have been bent and curved and glued together. The pedestal of the table is in better shape than the top, though I mean the finish is still worn on the legs. There's no carving or any design or anything. It's just a square pedestal with these layers here. It appears to still be oak, though there's no ray fleck, so it's not Quartersawn, and it's kind of strange how it has this little piece across the bottom. I'm not sure why they didn't continue the vertical wood all the way down. I mean, it's certainly original. It doesn't look like anything was changed. No miter joints or anything, just square pieces put together. But again, no maker's mark that I can find, no names, no factory designation. Completely looking on the bottom too, there's some bolts that are holding the legs onto the central pedestal. So yeah, I have no idea of where it came from, the age, the origin. I'm thinking it was, you know, early 20th century factory furniture, but I have no idea how to come up with a date for it. But I'm glad I found it. I think it will be fun to restore this and to see what we end up with. And so that's the story. Now we're gonna get on with stripping, sanding, staining, refinishing, all that fun stuff. And hopefully we end up with a nice table at the end of it. So the first question is, what kind of finish are we dealing with here? So I got myself a can of acetone and we'll find out. Google tells me that acetone turns tacky if it's shellac or varnish, and that's not turning tacky. And if it beads up, it's polyurethane, and I'm not seeing it bead up. And if it dissolves it, it's lacquer, but it's not doing that either. I tried a few other spots, including the bottom of the table where it had those heavy drips of furniture, and I mean, I got some brown spots on the rag, but that's it. The finish didn't seem to be dissolving or anything, so I'm a little mystified. Next, I'm going to try some methyl hydrate, which is an alcohol. Denatured alcohol is not very easy to come by here, so this should also dissolve shellac. If it is shellac, And yeah, still not telling me anything. It just goes wet and then dries. It's not feeling tacky or anything. Well, I'm a little disappointed, but it didn't really matter because the top is so damaged I was going to strip that down anyways. But I had thought that maybe on the base I could just freshen the finish, in which case then I kind of want to know what I'm working with. So I know I can sand it all off, but I want to try stripping. I've never done that before. I went to the big box store and I looked for something that was low VOC, non-toxic, and I found this stuff. And reading the instructions, brush it on, wait 15 to 30 minutes, cover it with saran wrap so it doesn't dry out, and then scrape it off. It's supposed to have no odor. We'll see. Let's work on one side at a time. Got a disposable brush and some plastic wrap. Right. I'm smelling something, kind of almost smells like water-based poly. It's got sort of that smell, maybe, I don't know. And sorry, I'm kind of neglecting the camera, but... All right, that's one half and it went really quickly. The plastic wrap is supposed to keep it from drying out, and I'm going to do the other side right away, and I'm not going to do plastic wrap on that. I'm kind of curious because it's not very hot in here, so I don't really feel like it's any risk of drying out, and if I don't have to waste plastic wrap, I would like to not do that. So let's see. Where this water stain is, I'm going to make sure it's a good coating. Same over here where there's this big black blob of stain or burn or something. And now we wait, and I'm still going to open the window and get a fan going, which will unfortunately affect the audio. Just about 30 minutes, and this might tell us what the finish is, because the instructions say 15 to 30 minutes for varnish, but if it's polyurethane, they say 1 to 2 hours. So, I don't know. We're going to do it. Rip up the plastic. Well, there's something coming up there. Yummy. We're definitely still got color in the wood. Interesting. Now let me quick turn you over to this side. So on this side I did not use the saran wrap. And it's still, yeah. Pretty similar. So I'm going to turn the camera off and finish degooping this. Bring you back after. One more thing I'm supposed to do is wipe it down with water to neutralize it, or it'll keep working. Wow, that's I think I need another rag. I expected more of the color to get taken off with stripping, but I do appreciate the low VOC of this. But I think I'm still going to need to sand it. It's sort of the, is it really a time saver will be the question. Needless to say, I'm kind of done for the evening after this, because this is now going to have to thoroughly dry. So I shouldn't have been so impatient about the color, because once it dried overnight, then you can definitely tell that the top finish has been stripped off. This is the side where I used the saran wrap. This is the side where I didn't. That side is actually worse. I'm by no means upset. I mean, I know there's still color here. It is just deep into the grain lines. I think that's the nature of oak. And I knew I was always going to need to sand anyways. For one thing, there's these two discolorations that still need to be solved. But there's a few spots, like here. There is a deep scratch right there. There's a scratch there. And there's a few other spots out here where it's scratched, but that's okay. I'm just looking at this as part of the whole refinishing process. So next I applied stripper to the pedestal and to the underside of the top, and it worked great on the pedestal, not so good on the bottom of the top, and I'm not quite sure why, because I used the same technique. Here's a close-up of the pedestal and the legs. They're pretty well stripped down. I need to now do a lot of sanding to clean things up. So ignore that side. I've already been sanding at it. I got a fair bit off, but there was a lot left behind, and I just don't know why. I was wondering if maybe the top had been refinished once already in this table's lifetime, but that nobody ever bothered refinishing the underside of the top, so maybe there's something very different about that particular finish versus what was on top. I don't know. It's not really that big a deal because over here, this was about 10 minutes of work with a random orbit sander using 80 grit, and I've got it pretty well down. I've been hand sanding the skirt with a sanding block, and that's also been coming off really nicely. And so that's going to be my future for a couple of evenings. A lot of sanding, hand sanding, and cleaning up until I get that to a point where we can start putting a finish back on it. Okay, much later, time for the first check-in. I've gone over the whole table with 80 grit, and I'm pretty happy. I just got a couple of things I want to show you. The pedestal base is looking good, and the top is mostly looking good. On this side were those two stains. That one is pretty good. It was somewhere around here, and from stripping and sanding, it is mostly gone. This is where the black stain was, and it is still here, so I want to try taking care of this. And I read about oxalic acid, and apparently Barkeeper's Friend is full of oxalic acid, so I'm going to try that right now to see if I can lighten this up. What I read online was using a paste, and this one is a liquid, but just spread it out and leave it for about 15 minutes is my understanding. So I will check back in when that is done and we'll see what it looks like. Also, on the other side of the table there was some green paint, and this oak is a very porous wood and there's still a little bit of green in there, and so I'm wondering if I can just pick at it to try to clear it out. I think that's a lot better. I'm going to still work on it a little bit more, see if I can get it better. First round is wiped off, and of course it's still looking wet, which affects things, but I think it's a little bit lighter. But I'm going to do another round of application and waiting. I've heard some people say that each time gets it a little bit lighter. Like this part is especially still looking a bit dark. This is better. If I can just get it lighter, you can always add stain to make it darker, but we want to get rid of that stain. So yeah. Here we go again, a bit more. Okay, it's been a little over an hour. I did like 3 applications, and the last application I left soak for like a half hour. I can still see it, but I'm going to turn on this fan now to thoroughly dry it. And it started looking better almost immediately, and what I did is I pulled out my little probe here, and I was getting into these grooves of this oak, and I'm just scraping out what looks like either old stain or some old paint or something, and it's actually looking a lot better. So I will be really interested to see what this looks like once we get it fully dry. I'm not even sure if you can pick it up on camera, but I definitely see little black flecks coming out as I drag the probe through these lines. Okay, wow, it's already looking a lot better as it dries. This part here still needs to dry a lot more, but that's interesting, very interesting. So after 80 grit, I moved on to 150 grit, and I'm still going to do a little bit of 220, but at the same time, I'm also looking forward to my finishing regime. So on the bottom of the tabletop, I thought that was a good place to test out some stain, and I found this dark walnut varathane gel stain in the cabinet, which I kind of like the look of. And you know, you're supposed to test things in a small inconspicuous area, so I did some in the middle of the bottom of the tabletop, and actually I liked it so much I just went ahead and I've done the whole bottom of the table already with this stain. This is a varathane gel stain. Its color number is 469 dark walnut. Here's a close-up look, and this to me looks a whole lot better than the table did originally, and this is just stained. Of course I still have to top coat it. And apologies for the noise now, but I've got the exhaust fan going. If you've never used a gel stain before, it looks like pudding. It is very thick, but you still need to mix it thoroughly. This stuff is great for vertical surfaces, so it's not going to be very runny, but it is a little bit more labor intensive to apply. But as with regular stain, you wipe it in, wait a few minutes, and then wipe it off. And in case you're curious, and I am, this is the part where that black stain was, so I'm hoping that I get an even coverage here and that there won't be any ability to tell that there was a stain. Okay, I've done a quarter of the tabletop. It's been a couple of minutes, and now we can just buff away any excess. And this is looking amazing. I can't tell. There was this big black stain here and it is completely gone. And yeah, there are still some nicks and dings. I decided that, you know, this is a 100-year-old table. I'm not looking for something brand new pristine. I'm kind of happy that it's actually got some wear marks. I put the pedestal on this pole so it can hang here sideways. That's more for when I get to putting on polyurethane, because then I can keep it fairly flat. But it still makes it nice for this application too. Okay, the pedestal is now finished and can dry, and so is the top. After the stain, I'm applying a coat of shellac. The shellac really adds a shine. Of course, it's wet right now, but even so, it wakes up the wood and gives it a brightness. And after the shellac is dry, then I sand it down with 220, and then I move on to, being a table, I want the protection of a film finish like polyurethane. I'll do at least 3, probably 4 coats on the tabletop and 3 coats on the underside and on the legs. And having the pedestal on this pole here, even though it makes it rock a bit, it lets me apply the finish here on the flat. So I really have very little issue with any drips. It just means I have to wait a few minutes for this to dry before I can pivot it to the other side and so on. So it breaks things up a bit. So while I was working on refinishing the pedestal base, I came across another mystery, or maybe a quirk, about this piece. See, my wife and I were thinking that I should maybe add some leveling feet, so I'm taking a close look at the bottom of the feet, and I realized that it's like they used to have feet, because there's a mounting hole here and here and here, but there's nothing on this one. It makes no sense at all. Why would they have spots for 3 feet but not a 4th? And while I was taking a closer look at the base, I came across something else kind of strange. I had wondered why they had this sideways piece at the bottom of the pedestal, but I mean, it looks to me old and original, and I was thinking maybe this was so that there was side grain on the floor and not end grain that would attract water. But if you look inside the base, you'll notice that these bolts are all 4-sided, they're square, but the next bolt in is a more regular 6-sided bolt, and that's the same on every one of the locations. And while I'm looking at that, I realize that this part here is not finished, whereas the rest of the thing inside, I know it's really hard to see with the light. All the way down there, the inside of the pedestal was finished, but here, this little bit at the top is not. And I know I'm flipped upside down here. I was talking about the top, but this of course is the bottom. So yeah. Now I'm not convinced anymore that this piece is original. Maybe it was added and they raised the table up by 2 inches at some point in the past. Again, no maker's mark, no manufacturing mark. I'm kind of guessing. But let's work on getting this thing back together. So I want to get the mechanism back installed. So I've got the hardware. It needs to go back. And I'm going to be using the same mounting holes, but I just want to add a little bit of reinforcement. So I've taken some of these big toothpicks and I've chopped them down in size, and I'm going to add one to each of the holes, and that just gives a little bit more wood in there for the screw to bite into. Just a little dab of glue, and I'll just stick one into each hole. I learned that from my dad years ago. He would use that for like if you were putting you want to put a screw into like a bit of concrete block, you can just tap some wood into the hole. I do like that I have the marks so I know exactly where I need to put each piece, though I do hate slotted screws. There we go. So just adding a little bit of toothpick, just tightened up the hole enough so that the screws felt really nice and secure as they drove them home, though I have to admit I was really tempted to get some Robertson screws out. And now these 4 bolts pop into these 4 holes on the base. It is easier with 2 people, but it is manageable. And then the wing nuts just need to get put into place on each of those. So summing things up, we started with this beat up old table that we found on the side of the road. The finish was destroyed. It was stained in several places, but I thought there was promise. So I started with this chemical stripper, followed that with a whole bunch of sanding, then this dark walnut stain, then a seal coat of shellac over top of that, followed by multiple coats of water-based polyurethane. I did 3 coats on the base and in the underside, and on the top I did 4 coats for extra protection. And I am really happy with how it turned out. I am just loving the Quartersawn White Oak with all the ray flecks, but remember what this looked like at the beginning, with the finish was totally shot. There was paint marks here. Here was a large pale spot of a stain. At least I'm pretty sure it was back here, though I suppose it could have been up here. My point being is I can't find it anymore. It's completely invisible. And the same with right here was this hideous black stain or chemical residue or something, and it's completely gone. I would defy anyone to pick it out without knowing ahead of time. The pedestal wasn't that bad. The legs were a bit worn out, but now it's all renewed and looking just as pristine as the top. So that was a whole ton of work, but it turned out great. I am so happy I decided to save this piece. But that's it for this one. Thanks for stopping by. Hope you learned something. I know I did.